So for those who are just joining, this is Christina Mand-Lakhiani, traditionally, Honest Conversations. And today I have a wonderful guest, Shelley. Hello, Shelley. Welcome to Mind Valley.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for finding time to talk to us. And it's going to be a very interesting topic. We actually haven't talked about that on this show in quite a long time, if ever. So it's going to be an interesting topic. And while people are still coming in, because it will still go on for a while, I'm going to introduce my guest. So I'll introduce my guest officially. Shelley Robinson is a certified family wellness coach, reparenting advocate, cycle breaker, conscious parenting educator, and the founder of Raising Yourself. Her passion in life is to equip parents with the tools and support they need to offer themselves and their children more compassion and unconditional love. Throughout her work, she hopes to normalize and build awareness about inner child work, raising ourselves, breaking generational cycles, and what it looks like for parents to take radically good care of their needs. So join Shelley on Instagram and Facebook. In fact, Shelley, while I continue introducing you, if you could leave your handle, it would be very helpful. So join Shelley on Instagram or Facebook to discover her latest tips and talks on how to live your truest life, empower the next generation, and to do it all with plenty of grit, grace, and humor along the way. So welcome once again.
Thank you. I'm gonna leave my handle here and get it. It's so good to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I know we had this scheduled back in the fall and I had to go out of town and unexpectedly. So I have been looking forward to this chat for so long. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad that you actually had the patience to wait for the reschedule. What we're going to talk about today is how to reparent parents. I'm rephrasing, of course.
Yeah, sure.
But before we go, when we're talking about parenting, because it's such a private and personal topic, I do want to ask you a little bit about, I believe you must have kids and,
yes. I have two kiddos.
Just if you could tell us about you as a parent yourself, nothing complicated or long.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to. So I do have two kids. I have a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I feel like those are such different ages to be parenting. So it's been so interesting. And I started this reparenting journey and just really getting into conscious parenting probably about a decade ago. But yeah, I mean, I consider my kids my little life coaches. That's how I refer to them, because I think they're always teaching me things that I have either forgotten about or didn't know. And we're always learning from each other. So it's just such a cool journey, and it's so humbling. And I think when we're willing to learn from our kids, like it's such a wonderful relationship for both of us. So yeah.
In tune with that question, I want to ask the people who are online right now to leave in the chat if you have kids, and if you want, you can even leave the number, how many kids you have, or if you don't have kids. I believe a lot of people here would be the ones with the kids. What I want to ask is, you were talking about generation cycles, and I want to start with that because I kind of feel that if we're going to start talking about reparenting, maybe we should take a step back and and look into what is the generational cycle, how does it form, or how does it affect us? Because I think that's an interesting topic to begin with.
Yeah, it really is. I love the opportunity to kind of zoom out, because I think reparenting is a little bit, further down that conversation. So generational cycles are patterns or mindsets or behaviors that are passed on from simply one generation to the next. And it can, it's a benign term. It doesn't have to have any meaning. And so really empowering and positive and optimistic patterns can be passed down, just like unhealthy and invalidating patterns can be passed down. So my work and my passion is really to help parents kind of bring awareness to cycles they might not even realize they've inherited, and equip them with the tools and the resources that help them to break those so that we're not passing them on to our kids. And I always like to add that this is never about shaming or pointing fingers at the previous generation, because I try to make the assumption that our parents and the parents before them were doing the best they had with what they had available to them at that time. But it's more about just acknowledging things that we don't want to pass on to the next generation and healing the parts of ourselves, reparenting, as we'll talk about today, those parts of ourselves that allow us to break those cycles.
So I will have to set the ground a little bit, because I need to understand where we're going to take this conversation.
Sure.
It on the surface, it really looks like it's about parenting. And I actually saw that some people said that they don't have kids,
Yeah.
the group, which is kind of fun. But also, on the other hand, if I think about reparenting, it does feel a little bit like, I mean, we might not have kids, but we all have been kids, and we've had, hopefully, parent figures, or someone who replaced the absence of parent figures. So is our conversation going to be more about how we influence our kids, or is it more about how you see yourself in that relationship?
I think, gosh, that's tough. I think it honestly is a little bit of both. I do think I'll probably just naturally end up talking about how it relates to how we parent, because that's kind of the end game for me and what I'm passionate about. However, I want to mention that this work is really for anyone with or without kids, because we can still break cycles whether we have children or not. We might have inherited some mindsets about things that aren't serving us well in our life, that we don't want to continue in our own lives, and we can break cycles within our own lives as individuals. But what I talk about all the time in my community and on my platforms is how that ends up trickling down to our children. So I think we'll probably spend a bulk of our time there, but certainly this work is for people with or without kids. It's really applicable to everyone.
Meanwhile, I want to ask probably a question that you probably get asked a lot. So
Yeah.
how do we parent our kids wrong?
How do we parent our kids wrong?
Yeah, but before that, maybe I need to give a little bit of a context to that question. So, being a parent, of course, I am kind of conscious of what's going on in that niche, and I realize that this style of parenting has been changing probably in the past like 20 years, maybe longer, and there is no one way of parenting, as far as I can tell, at least judging
No,
by
absolutely
all the
not. Wouldn't that be
arguments in
nice?
mommy forums.
Right.
So what could be like the common mistakes that a lot of contemporary parents doing? Because just why am I asking that? I know there's research that shows that contemporary Harvard students have actually much lower executive functioning that Harvard students had, say 10, 20 years before them. So obviously something is not right.
Sure. That's an interesting fact. I do feel like I read that somewhere. So yeah, I don't know that I would ever frame anyone parenting like wrong, but I think sometimes where we do miss the mark based on these generational cycles we've inherited is, well, I'm going to quote something that there's a neuroscientist and a researcher named Stephen, and I apologize if I'm saying his name wrong. I think it's Bourget. And what he found in his work and in his research is that human beings, like what the number one thing we need to thrive is reciprocity. And another way to say that literally is to be well received, or to be in tune with other people. So what that means in the parenting world is a lot of times, and I think the generation before us and the generation before us, they were trying to survive on a different level, but they thought, my child has shelter, my child has clothes, my child has food, that's enough. I'm parenting. But what we're finding is that really what children and really what all human beings need is to be emotionally attuned to someone, as particularly their caregiver. So it's not enough to have the food and the shelter and the clothing. Of course, that's that's the foundation for feeling physically safe. But really what kids need beyond that is emotional safety. And so parents struggle with that because they were never really taught how to feel safe with their own emotions, right? And that's not their fault, and that's not a judgment or a criticism of parents. But if we as adults are terrified of our own feelings and we do everything in our power to avoid them and numb them and run away from them, which is natural because they're uncomfortable, then it is very hard for us to be emotionally attuned to our kids. So like I always tell parents, the very, very first step in this work is learning how to be a safe space for your own feelings, your anger, your grief, your rage, your overwhelm, and practicing going through those feelings instead of going around them. And when I say around them, I mean using coping mechanisms that we all do, like food and screens and alcohol and all the things that just kind of tamp down that discomfort that we feel being human.
So to create that safe space for your children, you obviously have to process your own emotions, but I've been in personal growth for 20 years, and I can tell that there are not many mainstream teachers who explain how to, we are told what's not good, that screens and alcohol and whatnot and food, these are not good, but how do you break the cycle? Where do you start? A lot of the parents are so busy with earning money and paying the bills that they don't have time for themselves.
Yeah, it seems so impractical, and that's what makes this so hard, is that it takes time. It's definitely not the more efficient route. But just to give you like a really specific actionable example, you have, let's say you get feedback from your boss and it hurts your feelings or it's angering. And so the first step is being mindful of the feelings that are bubbling up and breaking that cycle by noticing, I want to go have a glass of wine. And I'm not demonizing wine, but I'm just giving you an example of like ways that we sometimes use those mechanisms to kind of suppress those feelings. But you have to be mindful and become aware of what your knee-jerk reaction is to uncomfortable feelings. That's like step one, is the noticing. Because right now, a lot of times we're just doing it so unconsciously, we don't even have the awareness that we're doing it. And so once you've noticed that, once you've said, okay, I'm noticing that I'm angry or that hurt my feelings or I feel shamed about that feedback, then the second step is, where is that coming from? Am I ashamed of making mistakes? Did I pick up some sort of narrative from my family of origin, from school? You know, we pick these narratives up all over the place. It's not always just from our families. And what do I need to say or believe so that I no longer have that shame attached to that belief? So, you know, if you make a mistake or you get feedback that hurts your feelings, you're identifying with like your behavior. You're saying, I am bad because of that. And it's about rewriting those beliefs that we are not bad because we make mistakes or because we get feedback from our boss that is upsetting. And it's just acknowledging that and kind of overwriting those beliefs that are keeping us stuck in that shame cycle.
Mm-hmm. So, but contemporary world believes, and maybe I'm generalizing, that some level of criticism and fire under your tail is good for your development. How do you break out of that cycle? How do you find courage to actually not over criticize yourself, because or your children for that matter? Very often we are hard on them, not because we don't like them, but because we want them to be better.
Right. Yeah, it's a completely different paradigm shift, and it's a totally different mindset, and it's very radical. It feels radical compared to what we're used to, right? So I think shifting the mindset that, do you want to change based on fear, or do you want to change those beliefs based on self-compassion and love? So you can accomplish change either way. You can scare a kid into compliance. You can criticize yourself into changing, right? Let's say you want to start changing the way you eat or, you know, have a healthier lifestyle. You can criticize yourself into those changes, but you sacrifice the relationship with yourself along the way. So it's truly changing your mindset about how you want to be motivated. Do you want to be motivated by love and unconditional acceptance of yourself? Or do you want to be motivated by judgment and criticism? And it's making that really conscious choice and then acting in accordance with that. And when you can do that with yourself, it is so much easier to do with your kids. And I think we naturally want to be that way with our kids, right? We don't want to motivate them because we've screamed at them or threatened them or made them feel badly about themselves. I don't think most parents want to do that. but we don't really always apply that to ourselves. We don't say, I deserve that too. We just assume that we're going to motivate ourselves by feeling badly about ourselves.
So I guess a follow-up question would be, you might logically understand it, but almost all the examples that we see in the world are talking about the opposite path, because even if we take popular culture, it's a common story, you know, through a lot of resistance and fear and failures, success happens. So like the concept of tough love, for example, you need that. So where do you look for role models or examples or research for people who actually want to be a little more certain that it is possible, that you can rise through encouragement rather than through punishment?
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's so many wonderful resources now, you know, and that's the beautiful thing about this work. It's becoming more popular, but I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with the work of Dr. Shefali, Alfie Kohn. There's so many gentle parenting, respectful parenting creators and people out there just trying to build awareness around this, that sometimes just going on social media platforms and taping that in can bring about so much content and so many resources now that it's accessible, and there's so much science behind it now. That's the other great thing, is that this isn't just someone's random opinion. They're truly, you know, people are studying this and researching it and saying that children and adults who are motivated intrinsically, like because they genuinely want to do and be good in the world and not because they're terrified of the consequences, are just generally happier, have better mental health, and are just better citizens in the world than when they're being influenced by extrinsic motivation, meaning they're terrified of the outcome. They're trying to please other people just to feel like accepted. Mm-hmm. So it always starts with that radical self-acceptance first.
Mm-hmm. So of course, a natural thing to ask would be, I guess, right now, the bar is quite high.
Yes, right.
So what do regular mortal humans do with their children if they understand that they snap, they are self-critical, they don't accept themselves? Where do we start?
I think,
do we send our kids for adoption to someone better? I'm of course not being serious.
You know, it does feel overwhelming. And so if you're listening to this and you're like, I can't, this feels too much. I've got to get dinner on the table. I've got to fold the laundry. Like, it feels overwhelming. I just want to remind everyone, and we know this intellectually, but you still have to hear it. I have to hear it a lot. Like, none of us is doing this perfectly. So one of the most important pillars in this work of reparenting and parenting is repairing, because we're all going to mess up and we're all making mistakes. And so when kids see us apologizing and owning up to our mistakes, they know that we're human and they don't have to be perfect. But the other important aspect of that is forgiving ourselves. And it just naturally allows you, once you're forgiving yourself and you're offering yourself compassion, you are withdrawing yourself from that cycle of shame and criticism, which makes you less likely to mess up and make those mistakes and yell. Because when you're under that weight of, oh, I messed up, oh, I'm the worst parent, oh, I'm this and that inner dialogue is the very thing that's going to probably make you yell again, right? Because you're going to snap more easily. So when we're in a posture of like, gosh, I messed up, I wonder what was underneath of my yelling. And when we can get curious about our own behavior instead of judgmental and critical, we can change it more quickly. We don't stay stuck in those patterns as long.
Mm-hmm. You know, I just recently had a very interesting situation with my daughter where I said something and then I suddenly felt that I was a little too harsh on her. And of course, I apologized, but I still felt very horrible the rest of the day.
Yeah.
How does self-forgiveness show? Does the child even know? Because I apologize kind of, you know, superficially, at least on not superficial, but on the surface. I tried to correct the mistake. How important is an actual self-forgiveness? Because I mean, my oldest child is 15. There are still some things that I cringe when I think about what I did when he was much smaller.
Same. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the self-forgiveness part is just as important as the apology, but it's going back to yourself. So if you were harsh on them, or yelled or what, whatever, all the mistakes we all make. It's kind of, again, it's that compassionate curiosity. It's looking at your own behavior, sitting with it for a minute and saying, gosh, I wonder where that came from. And it could be something as simple as like, I slept horrible last night. I need water. I need a snack. It doesn't always have to be some deep inner child wound, or it could be something a little deeper. Like that was really upsetting because that reminded me of a time in childhood that I wasn't heard. Like an example I always share about myself is, and when I really started this work, this was like 10 years ago. I remember, I know we all have these parenting moments that we cringe and we regret vividly. And this is mine. My son was 5 and he didn't want to brush his teeth or take a bath, something of that nature where it was like hygiene related, but he wouldn't listen to me. And it was so upsetting, disproportionately upsetting to me than it should have been for like, given the typical resistance of a 5-year-old, right? Like I was seeing red and it scared me. And I was like, where did that come from? I felt like scary monster mommy. And that was kind of my first step in like getting curious about my anger and being like, that felt like it came from a deeper place than just me being annoyed with him not brushing his teeth. And so that's when I started getting really like into the work of reparenting and feeling in that moment activated because I didn't feel heard. And that wound of not being heard as a kid was showing up like 35 years later as an adult because I had never acknowledged it and healed it and dealt with it. So it was just, those things go underground and we think, oh, they're not there. I'm fine. Like my childhood, it was good. And our childhoods could have been good. That doesn't mean we didn't pick up some stuff along the way, right? We can still have beautiful gardens that have a few weeds that need to be pulled. So it's not like this all or nothing, black and white sort of thinking. So I had to deal with that like feeling. And I don't know if you've ever felt this, but that feeling of helplessness when your child will not listen to you and you don't feel heard, you feel powerless. And it kind of catapults you back in time to that feeling that you might have had as a child. So I think that like the noticing your triggers and your anger and where that stuff bubbles up for you is really important to figure out what feelings and what wounds you really need to sit with and work on healing.
I think, and this is of course my personal experience, I think it's a little easier to love children. It comes naturally for mothers than to love yourself.
Totally.
The same question, isn't like, can you be truly compassionate and loving if with your children if you still eat yourself for every single transgression you do? Or is it possible just because naturally it's so much easier to love them?
Oh yeah, I absolutely think you can love your children and also feel, really negative and, talk to yourself negatively. You absolutely still can. It's exhausting. And I think that doing it that way kind of relies a little bit more on willpower, right? So when we're trying to adopt a new habit, whether we want to, drink more water, stop eating candy at 3 p.m. every day, whatever, yelling at our kids less. If we want to do those things, we can like white knuckle it. We can do that. That's an option. But eventually if any of us have tried that way, we know eventually like we snap and we indulge in that thing that we're trying to like refrain from doing. So you can do that with your kids, but eventually you just run out of energy to rely on that willpower. So when you're compassionate to yourself, it's a natural extension to be that way to your kid. And it's more sustainable in the long run.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. I know it's a weird question, but I just somehow.
It's not. It's a great question. It's like the crux of this work, really, because, and I would never, ever, ever want a parent to feel bad. Like, gosh, I'm speaking so horribly to myself. That means I'm not going to be kind to my kid. And it's just not that simple. I know all of us struggle with, negative self-talk. We all have that inner critic, and we also have the capacity to show our kids compassion. But really, our kids are partly here. I mean, I don't mean this like it's their responsibility, but one of the miraculous things about them is that they kind of shine a light on parts of ourselves where we're like, well, if they deserve that compassion and if they deserve that grace and generosity. Like, why do I think I don't deserve that? And where in the world did I pick up that belief? And that's what kind of forces us to go back in time a little bit and say, at some point, I started believing that I didn't deserve that. And I wonder why.
Sometimes, and I know your older child is 12, sometimes you
Yeah.
get to the point with your children. In my personal experience, my son has Asperger's, so it's not something which you
Mhm.
often know answers naturally to. So what do you do in situations where you feel that just reparenting yourself is not enough, and the problem is so big that no matter how conscious, how open-minded, how woke you are, you still don't know the answer to that question with your children? Like you said,
Oh,
you're helpless.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that, because I do think this can become really overwhelming, and it's not meant to be done alone. And there are areas of expertise that we don't have because we didn't go to school and we didn't study these. So with, kiddos with Asperger's or any sort of neurodiversity, it's always appropriate and important to reach out to people who really specialize in that, to be on your team of support so that you can attune to your child, right? So if you don't understand their inner world because, you didn't study that and that's not your field of expertise, I always encourage people to, find the right professional partners to help you understand their inner world so that you can attune to them and say, gosh, I understand their brain a little bit better. And now that I do, I can meet them exactly where they're at and not have like unreasonable or, expectations that don't make sense for their world. So yeah, I think finding that support is absolutely necessary, whether it's like through therapy or whatever, professional support system you need, because that's one of the hardest things in our modern society, is that we're all doing this in a very isolated way. And we don't have the community that we want or that we crave for lots of different reasons. And it does make it harder. So finding other people and other professionals is such an important part of this.
I can see we have Aritreta almost joining us, but I just asked the last finish up question, but I didn't ask that specifically about like kids with neurological, Asperger's is not a neurotypical kid. The parents of children who are considered neurotypical, is there space or are there situations where just being conscious is not enough? Could you just
Of neurotypical children, is that?
Yeah.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I think there are probably limitations to all of this, right? So we could be, as like you said, woke and conscious and reparenting, and our child might be struggling with something that we might have a blind spot around, and that's not a bad thing. Like, we can't know everything and be everything for them. And so that's when finding people who can ask the right questions and dig deeper and come at whatever the problem is at different angles can be really helpful. So I don't think this is meant to be like, I'm going to reparent myself, I'm going to be a conscious parent, and I'm never going to have any problems. Like, again, we all, myself included, have blind spots where our child might be struggling with something that we literally are just like, I can't do this. I don't get it. I'm doing all the things, I'm reading all the books. And, but that being said, that doesn't make the work you're doing, it's not being done in vain. You're still doing what you need to do to support yourself so that you can support them and that you can find the resources you need to support both of you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have Aritreta joining us, I believe, right? Hello.
Yes, hello. And thank you for saying my name correctly as well. That's appreciated. I think my question, should I just say it now, or I'm not sure if she can read it. Okay.
Hi, yeah.
Hi. I guess condense it. My question in this family planning phase, I don't have any of my own children yet.
Okay.
Is a concern for parenting in a well-rounded way. I did come from a fairly abusive type of childhood, but I don't want to in terms of correcting or overcorrecting, I don't want to instill many fears on them. And I also don't want to be parenting in a way that is smothering because of all of my awarenesses. While they're still children, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So you're looking for like a balance, right?
A balance, and for them to, with everything that pulls them in different directions in the world, to still be a primary, I guess, source of influence on them. And I think I grew up in a household where my parents worked many jobs. They weren't able to be present. There were lots of other parental figures, and they did end up holding a lot more influence than my parents. And it became quite toxic in a way that I began to see them almost as the enemy or not to be trusted and those things. And I don't think that the opposite or the answer is to just make sure I'm the only person around my children ever and they should be homeschooled and never leave the home and never try anything. I don't think that that's the solution either. But if you have any suggestions there.
I love that question. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think it's such a good point about how when we want to break cycles, sometimes we accidentally swing the pendulum so far to the other side that we're now creating, and maybe it's better a little bit, but it's still going to be a cycle that our kid ultimately has to break. So what you're explaining, you don't want to hover over them. You don't want to be the helicopter parent. So I think what comes to mind for me is trusting our children in a way that still keeps them safe, especially when they're really young. And it's by allowing them to take safe and appropriate physical and emotional risks with us at home, while being their anchor and allowing them to make mistakes, allowing them to be human, and you still giving them your unconditional love when they mess up. And then when they go out into the world, they have that kind of emotional frame of reference, and they've built that confidence with you. And if there's another parent in the picture, with that other parent. And so they have that really, really strong foundation, so that when they do go out into the world and they're exposed to other influences, they kind of have that anchor to always refer back to and to feel grounded in, right? We all want to feel grounded. And I think about growing a family like growing a garden a little bit, and I don't want to get too far out there, but these metaphors help me, because if you're thinking about your kids, you want to plant them in this fertile soil that they can grow and thrive in. And that's really what giving them that trust and honoring their autonomy and saying, like, I am here for you and I'm going to guide you, but I'm also going to let you take some risks and make mistakes. And you're going to come back to the safety of this nest, when you go out into the world and you're around other people, and they're not always going to get it right. We're not getting it right all the time. Right. So it's kind of that balance of honoring them at home, so that when they go out into the world and are exposed to other influences, they always have an anchor to come back to. And if they do make a mistake, they know they're not going to be afraid of you, but you're going to kind of problem solve it together. Does that help a little?
That was a lot. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Actually, on the tail of Eritrea's question, I want to ask, when do you start, maybe funny question, but when do you start that kind of relationship with your children? Because when they're babies, obviously your relationship is a little bit like a nurse, because they, yes. So when does it start?
Right.
Actually?
I mean, honestly, in different ways, it really starts from the beginning, as far as obviously, I mean, you always have to keep your child safe. So when I say trust your child, you obviously have to do that in a container that keeps them safe. But just for instance, trusting that when they cry, for instance, this is just an example, that they're telling you something, that they're communicating something to you, and that they're not actually trying to manipulate you. And sometimes that is something you do hear more often than you would think in the parenting space. And again, that's not a criticism of parents, but they say, oh, my baby's manipulating me, like they're crying again because they want something. And they've picked up that narrative maybe from their parents, or they've heard that from someone. And it's right from the start thinking, my baby is communicating something to me, and I trust that, they have a need that I need to meet. And so I really do think it starts from birth, and it looks differently at every age and stage, right? But it's assuming the best in your child. It's not assuming they're perfect. It's just assuming the best in them and operating from that lens instead of operating from a lens of they're bad, they're naughty, they're here to drive me bonkers, because it really does change the way you react or respond to them based on what you've kind of got going in the back of your mind about what you think their behavior means.
So Bianca, if we have anyone else joining us, please do bring them up continuously as we keep talking. Another question, which is a little bit of follow-up question to that discussion, is so let's say your child is a little bigger, because smaller children, their mistakes are usually about safety. But let's say if the child goes to school already and you see your child doing something which you would disagree with, but it's not strictly speaking not safe. How do you keep that balance between trying to, knowing what's best for a child? Very simple example. My daughter has a very funny taste in the way she dresses. And sometimes I really feel like suggesting to wear something else, but I'm not sure when it's too much.
Right. Oh my gosh, that's such a tricky conversation. And I find now that I have a 12-year-old, it honestly, and I don't want to scare people off from older children, but it gets a little harder. It just gets a little stickier because they have so much more independence and autonomy now. Right. And you can't they're not as easily to make them do things anymore. You can't just pick them up and leave. And now my 12-year-old can pick me up, which is a little scary, but I think it's an opportunity to kind of invite them into discussion about their values. And we talk about this in my family all the time, like, what are our family values? And when we're doing things that hurt other people, we always refer back to our values. So with your daughter, it could be an opportunity to say, well, what are your values when it comes to not just dressing, but, how you are perceived in the world and how you feel about yourself. And it's an opportunity to have a conversation without being really super attached to the outcome, which for us as parents is really hard because I know I've had these conversations with my older son, and if he thinks I'm attached to the outcome, if he thinks I'm going to have this conversation so that in the end he will do what I want, he sees through that so fast, and kids are so smart. And so getting curious and saying, well, how do you feel in that outfit? And how do you think that, comes across, and just opening up a dialogue so that you can understand better what's going on in their mind. And you might find something maybe they're a little bit insecure, and then it gives you an opportunity to talk through that. But it's just allowing that conversation to be organic and go where it goes without it meaning that you're going to get what you want in the end. And that's the hardest part. For me to keep my ego in check and say, I'm going to have this conversation so that they'll do what I want them to do.
So I can see Charles joining us, but again, I'm tempted, of course, to talk about, such things as tattoos and piercing in this kind of context. I haven't faced that problem, but I can imagine that this is a huge trial to our ability to let kids make their own choices when we are maybe not happy about these choices at all.
Right.
So Charles, I'll pass the microphone to you.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you, Shelley, for allowing me to just speak. And thank you for just hosting this event and just having this conversation. I think is very important. Me being a young adult and just leaving my parents, I've realized some things about our conversations, and that everything isn't either of our faults. It isn't anyone to blame. It's just a result of them just growing up and just seeing things from their perspective. And like what you said earlier, they did what they thought they were supposed to do.
Yes.
It's not necessarily that they were wrong about anything. How do I open up a conversation with them, being that I am an adult and that I'm not expecting them to necessarily apologize, but just have open dialogue?
Sure. Yeah. I thank you for asking that. I think that takes a lot of courage to even consider doing that. It really does, because it can feel uncomfortable and awkward and you don't want to hurt them. And it sounds to me like you're not in the position, you're not wanting to point fingers, but you also want to have a conversation about it. So I've told people before that starting those conversations can be helpful to start with me, start with yourself. say, I am working on changing some things in my own life, and you can describe it however you feel, in your own words. You can use the word journey, and that might not resonate with them, but in a way that, they'll understand what you're saying. And I've been thinking about my childhood a lot. And, I wondered if we could talk about some things that I think kind of hurt our relationship. And I really, if you come at it from a place of, I want to strengthen our relationship, and to do that, I want to be honest about some things that happened in childhood. Would it be okay if we talked about that, so that, you don't want to put them on the defensive, but you want to make it more about your growth and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Charles, but assuming that you want to strengthen your relationship with them, that's really the motivation behind it. So you want them to feel like, gosh, Charles wants to be closer to me. And in order to do that, he wants to talk about these things. And I'm not saying, I don't know your parents, and so I don't know how they'll receive that. But if you can make it about your own growth and your desire to be closer to them, I think it increases the chances that it will be a smoother conversation. But it still has the possibility to have some bumps and lumps, and that's not about you. And I think that's an important thing to remember. If they did get a little bit defensive, or they were feeling a little hurt, that's not necessarily about what you're saying. It's about kind of their egos being put in check. And that's true for all of us, right? Like sometimes feedback can hurt. And my kids have given me feedback that I'm like, ooh, like, ow. But I'm glad they did it, because I needed to hear it. And I want to be called out on things that make them feel like not seen or invalidated. Does that help answer your question, or does that give you a little bit of like guidance on how to approach that? Okay, good.
Perfect. I think that would work well.
Yeah, I really hope it goes well. And I am like giving you all the applause for if you decide to do this, because on the other side of it, it could be really transformational for you guys.
Charles, thank you so much. And before I pass the word to Debbie, I want to ask again a little bit in the tailwind of Charles's question. Do you approach your children as a parent with the same kind of message if you feel that maybe your connection is not as strong and you want to discuss certain things, maybe about your own mistakes in their upbringing?
Was that question from you, Christina? I'm sorry, or was that from another?
That was a question from me to Shelley.
Yes. And I think that can be so true. I feel like I can answer that personally, because I think as our kids get older, it's natural for them to want to be a little bit more with their peers. And you might be experiencing that with your 15-year-old. So it's easier for them to drift, and it's normal and it's natural and it's appropriate. But I think as parents, it's our job to, keep them anchored to us in a way, in a healthy way, not in a hovering helicopter way, but in a way that we are still their main sphere of influence. So just, saying, you know what, I miss you. I miss doing things with you. I love spending time with you, and just asking them and figuring out at each age, like, what are you into right now? And can we go do that thing together? And honestly, it gets a little bit harder and maybe even a little more awkward as they get older. Even with my son, who's 12, I'm like, we play a lot of video games together, because that is his jam. I am terrible at them, and it's not like my favorite thing to do, but it is so fun for him. And sometimes it doesn't have to be like a really deep conversation. It doesn't have to be like talking about their feelings. It can be like, hey, I see that you like that, and I want to do that thing with you. And that can build connection, and that can make them feel seen just by like enjoying a hobby that they like to do together.
I really appreciate your example of playing video games with them, because it unhooked so many things at once for, I think, quite a lot of people, because we are sometimes such perfectionists when it comes to raising our children that it's almost impossible. Yes. So I want to be mindful also that Debbie is waiting for her turn. So it's Debbie, right? Debbie, hi. Passing the...
Yes, hi.
Hi, Debbie.
Thank you. Hi. Hey, so I have an older child. He's 19 and a half, and he is definitely neurodiverse. So the thing that's so challenging for me is that I didn't get that. To me, he's a very high masking, high functioning, but now that he's out of the constraints of regular high school or regular extracurricular activities, I have to admit that this is the case. And I really have no idea where to find valid and like resources that are legitimate if that makes sense. I have no idea where to find that. And then also, because now I understand that I have been mishandling this situation for a while. You know, I'm just wondering what to do next. I don't know what to do. And I do have the situation that he has a younger sibling, and she doesn't believe us. She thinks we're just off our rockers. We're just making up stuff so that he can be a jerk. And it's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I bet. Well, I am sending you both a lot of love, because I'm like you said, I'm sure it's hard for both of you. And I think the fact that you're willing to do what you need to do right now to support him is amazing. And he might not be able to like articulate, he might not be ready to tell you like, that means a lot, Mom, but he knows that he's receiving that from you on some level. And I think what could be helpful is you mentioned that you feel like maybe you mishandled him in the past with like, and so I don't know if you two have had an opportunity to talk about that, where you think you mishandled him and where you think you could have done better, but you didn't know. So I think if you didn't know,
it is a matter of not understanding, and you don't know what you don't know, and having a conversation is virtually impossible. So I have to figure out the right time of day. Did you eat right? Did you sleep right? It's a real dance. So and because I didn't know any better, I always thought, oh well.
Right. Oh, I'm so sorry. The last sentence cut out. Debbie, do you mind repeating that little part at the end? Uh-oh. Christina, can you hear her? Now. Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, well, and he might have really strong feelings that require maybe a more objective third party, like a therapist or someone who specializes in neurodiversity, because sometimes there can be such an accumulation of feelings and stories that he's created around this relationship with you that it can just feel a little bit volatile for him. And so I don't know if I know therapy is not always accessible to everyone, but anyone who even specializes in neurodiversity and supporting parents and their children.
It's really hard to find, and it's really hard to find somebody that you're willing to trust, because I have absolutely gone through getting him therapists before, because one of his coping mechanisms when he was younger is he just started lying. And I told him, like, if you choose to keep lying, there's going to be a point where you're actually lying about yourself. Maybe you're lying about personal hygiene. If you're lying about when you do or do not brush your teeth, you do or do not eat, I will have to find a therapist for you, because I cannot convince you to be honest. You have to choose to be honest. And so I did find him a therapist, and she was magnificent, but then she retired.
Oh,
she retired. Yeah. So she didn't take, then later on, I felt like, okay, would be now another time to get someone. And I found a wonderful person. He was very, very highly regarded, but it became strange because he became so enamored and fascinated with my son's story, and my son got over it. So I went ahead and said, okay, well, you don't need to keep going with him if you feel like it's just not serving you. And then that therapist lashed out at me and said that I was being a bad parent for choosing not to keep staying with him. And I was like, really? Really?
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And so finding a good therapist is like finding a needle in a haystack.
It really is. Yeah, I understand.
And then when you have somebody who has credentials and they lash out at me because my son is saying, okay, this is not working out for me. I'm not comfortable in this situation. And that was really weird, really weird.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've asked your son this, and I don't want to oversimplify it, and I don't think this is a magic bullet, but have you ever just point blank asked your son, what do you need from me to feel supported? Like what?
Every day.
Specifically.
Every day. Every day.
It sounded like something. Yeah. And does he know?
So if I want to see him, I go in and he's home. He's home. I make the effort to go in to see him. I make the effort to check in. He's got that focus where when he's on his thing, he's on his thing. So I make sure I learn about it, and I talk to him about it, and I ask about it.
Yes.
I don't know. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I do
Every
think
day's a
I
new
know.
day.
Right. And Christina, and when we were chatting about this earlier, about this, like, when do you ask for help and when do you, it sounds like you're making such a strong effort. And I think sometimes these, and you said he has ADHD or he's neurodiverse.
He's neurodiverse. Yeah. So he doesn't have an official, diagnosis.
Yeah.
But
Debbie, it really helps to get an official diagnosis, because when we discovered that probably Hayden had neurodiversity as well, I was reluctant to accept the fact, but our school insisted that we do the testing, and tests are done usually for this kind of diagnosis by a whole lot of different doctors, and it really helps a lot. It paves the way. So if you can at least get the diagnosis, that would be very helpful for you to understand how to navigate it. Because from what you're saying, I don't recognize it as, for example, your symptoms are so different from what I know of the little slither of neurodiversity that I know.
Right. I agree. And I can speak from personal experience. I was just diagnosed with ADHD this past year, and just that diagnosis alone was like, and I'm not saying this is apples to apples with your son, Debbie, but it was such a huge weight lifted off of my shoulders because it made so much sense. I had so much shame around some of my behaviors and reactions to things and patterns that I had adopted over a lifetime. And I got that diagnosis and I started understanding that diagnosis, and just the shame I had unknowingly been carrying for like 4 decades just kind of, it really dissolved. It didn't go away completely, but I understood myself better. So, and I didn't feel that way until I got the diagnosis. So I would agree with Christina that I think, and it's hard, getting a diagnosis is not easy. And so I completely understand what you're saying. It's hard to find a good therapist. It's hard to find a doctor. Those tests that you have to take to get the diagnosis is hard, but I know that he's going to know that you're there supporting him through this, even though it might not feel like he's articulating it in that way.
I think we're at a stage where I would also need him to agree. And I don't
he has
think
to consent to that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome
for joining and for bringing up such a well, I wouldn't say it's your particular situation is very special, but something which we often struggle in our own ways, where we have a question that we just feel like we can't find an answer to. So thank you for asking the question. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left. So considering Debbie's question, I think a very logical question would be, Shelley, if people want to work with you, because you do work with children and parents, to go deeper and to discover what you were just sharing with us, how would they be able to do that? And do you work with
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. You can find my community on Instagram and Facebook under Raising Yourself. I offer a lot of different resources, products, different ways I can support you. I check my messages. So you can reach me that way. And those are really the two primary ways to connect with me and, find out what would be a good fit for how to work together.
So I want to ask a traditional question of people who are with us, and you probably know already. I want you to leave a heart to my wonderful guests. Those who are watching in recording, as usual, leave your hearts in the comments below. And you know what, Shelley, I do want to ask probably the question. And it's not a very fair question because it requires a generalization, but what would you like all parents of the world, contemporary parents, and in our part of the world, to know and to keep in mind when they interact with their children?
That you're allowed to be human. You are allowed to be human. You are allowed to make mistakes. And there's so much room for us to mess up, and our kids love us. And the most important thing is to love ourselves. To love ourselves so we can love our kids well.
I did want to bring up the topic about, the border between selfishness or being self-obsessed and actually healthy self-love, but I guess that will have to be left for the next discussion.
Yeah.
And I want to say that it was a very enjoyable conversation. Thank you so much. I subscribe to a lot of things that you you say, and even the names that you named. I really appreciate both Dr. Shafali and Alfie Kohn. And yes, I'm glad to have met you and to now know another amazing teacher and author who preaches the right thing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was so wonderful chatting with you and meeting everyone.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us as usual. Thank you. Thank you guys who joined us in the conversation with your pictures and with your honest questions. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Bianca, as usual. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.